main competencies that we seek to cultivate. One is legal literacy, so that we want people to understand the history, meaning, and significance of the religious liberty clauses of the First Amendment. So part of that has to do with training and educating people about those two clauses of the First Amendment, what they mean for their lives. But we also look at religious literacy, and we want people to understand how religion operates in private and public life using the tools and concepts of religious studies. And we see religious literacy and legal literacy being very closely linked, so that what you know about religion, how you think about religion, very much affects what then you think about the First Amendment and how we protect religious freedom. And we also think about this third competency of civil dialogue. So when we're talking about these very complicated and difficult questions, we want to have the skills to talk about, to talk with one another in respectful and nuanced ways. We don't expect that everyone will agree when we have these conversations, but we want to give them the tools to have respectful conversations. So today we'll be using the skills of civil dialogue to talk about the relationship between legal and religious literacy. And I think one orienting question for us today is when we say the term religious freedom, what do we mean? And I hope that today, in the hour that we have together, we'll look at the word religion in religious freedom, or the word religious, and ask, what does religious mean? And we'll also look at the word freedom. What does freedom mean? And so we're really taking a step back and looking at some of our assumptions about what religion is and what freedom is. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. So first, a really simple, well, might seem like a simple question. I would ask you all to define religion. So using, the sentence stem, religion is ... or you can define it however you want. But I'm curious to hear from you, how would you define religion? And you can type in your answer or you can unmute yourself. I should say there are no wrong answers. If you go to the American Academy of Religion, which is the professional association for the largest professional association in the world for scholars who study religion, there's sort of a running joke that if you get 10 religious studies scholars in a room at AAR, you'll get 15 definitions of religion. There's no real consensus about this. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are.
Well, this is Krista. I'll go ahead.
Great.
I think I was eating Cheetos. That's why I took the video.
No worries.
I think religion is a group of people that believe in a higher power that are, what do I want to say? They're a defined group.
Okay.
And practice like defined rituals. Mm-hmm. So that's what I think religion is, more so.
Great. So that's great. So that you've given us sort of a rich definition or set of things to think about. So a group of people, so in some sense we have an idea about a community here. So it's a group of people, and then you mentioned who have a belief in a higher power. So there's a belief perhaps that's involved in something that's greater than ourselves. Maybe we give that the word God, maybe we use a different word for it. And that practices a certain set of rites or rituals. So thinking about some beliefs, some communities that we're part of, and some of our behaviors. Okay. And then I see in the chat, I see someone say a system set up to support faith and worship. So again, we have a sense of belief here and also what we do with that belief, some sort of worship. And then I also see someone says a set of beliefs that answer key questions about life and drives action, so that the beliefs are driving our actions and that are shared with a community of like-minded individuals. So again, we're seeing these three parts. And then Joanna says, religion is a thought process, theology, or philosophy that joins people together in historical and ritual circumstances. Humans search for truths. Great. So I think in these different definitions, someone mentions Clifford Geertz, which is great. So we're seeing different kinds of definitions. Some of them are pulling on three different aspects, which I want to call attention to, are the things that we believe, some things that we do, rites and rituals, maybe something else. And then also the community that creates, or communities that we're part of. And also I want to point out that some of these definitions are causal in some ways. So we believe certain things, that religion is really primarily about belief, and that those beliefs are causing or leading to certain behaviors, that there's a flow in this sense from belief to behavior. maybe not all of them, but those are some of the things that I'm seeing in your response. So that's really helpful. So let's keep that in mind as we move on to the next thing. So my next question for you is, complete the sentence stem. Religious freedom protects. So we have a sense of what religion is. What does religious freedom protect? We just gave some, so thinking about what religion includes, what might religious freedom protect?
Our thoughts, for one.
Our thoughts, okay. So the things that we think, the things that we believe, great. So that's one thing that religious freedom protects. Is that the primary thing? Is that the only thing? Are there other things that religious freedom protects?
Being able to worship.
Someone says rituals, okay. Being able to worship, I heard, great. Our right to choose our religion, excellent. Beliefs, behaviors, and communities of belief, great, Tim. Our right to practice our faith, beliefs and practices. Okay, so I started, the first thing that we heard was about beliefs, our thoughts, our beliefs, the things that we believe, our right to believe, our right to change our beliefs. But some of these responses also mention, so I saw worship and I saw rituals, so things that we do. I see another that says practices. So one of the things that we'll talk about today is how far that extends. So does religious freedom just protect belief? What is religion? Is religion just about belief? Does it also protect our practices? And are those practices limited to rites and rituals, to acts of worship? Or does it also protect other kinds of practices? And then this third element that I heard in some of the responses about what religion is, which includes the community. So Paul here says, and the community with which we affiliate and identify. So when we're talking about religious freedom, as I said at the beginning, when we want to break out these two concepts, religious and freedom, first we're going to be looking at what is religion, and then we're going to be looking at what does religious freedom, what is the freedom actually protecting? Is it protecting all aspects of religion or not? So that was really, really helpful. Maybe moving a little bit more to the legal nitty-gritty before we go on. What does our Constitution protect? What does it actually say in the Constitution about religious freedom? Anyone happen to remember what it says in the First Amendment or what it says in the Constitution itself?
There should be no law that's passed to abridge the freedom of religion, right?
Yeah, so no law abridging freedom of religion. Actually, the Constitution, interestingly, protects two different aspects of religious freedom. So we often talk about 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. Some religious studies scholars talk about 6 because religion is protected in 2 different kinds of ways. So I'm seeing in the chat, someone said no establishment of religion and free exercise. That's right. So we talk about the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And then does anyone happen to remember what it says about religious freedom in the Constitution itself, not in the Bill of Rights or the amendments, but in the Constitution itself? It's mentioned one place. Anyone happen to remember what that is? It's the tricky one. So it's one I think that we all take for granted, and so we don't even think about it as its own sort of freedom protected, but it is called out separately in the Constitution. So in Article 6, it says that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So what that means in layman's terms is you can't be disqualified for a public office just because of your own religious tradition or not being religious. And then, of course, in the First Amendment, it says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So those 2 freedoms, free exercise and establishment, are sometimes a little bit in a productive tension. So non-establishment means that the government can't favor one religion over another, it can't favor religion over non-religion. And the Free Exercise Clause says that the government can't enact laws that would prohibit the free exercise of religion. And so many of the Supreme Court cases and lower court cases that have come out about religion are really about this balance of establishment and free exercise. What do you do to make sure that people can live out their religious traditions as they see fit without leading to an establishment of religion in the United States that would favor one religion over another? So that's what's in the Constitution, but then how you actually work that out and what religion means here and what qualifies as religion and what gets protected by the First Amendment is very, very complicated. So first, let's start with what is religion? And so this is where I think religious studies scholarship can be quite helpful for the conversation. So many of you in your responses when we were defining religion mentioned these three aspects of religious identity in different kinds of ways. And I want to expand on that. So at the Religious Freedom Center and in a lot of religious studies scholarship, we recognize that religion isn't just about the things that we believe. Belief can be important to religious identity, but religious identity isn't just about the things that we believe. So beliefs can include our theologies, our doctrines, our sacred narratives, our holy texts. It can include, our belief in God or Jesus or thoughts about who Muhammad is or who different sacred prophets are, but it also includes other kinds of beliefs, our social values and ethics. And this is where this diagram that splits it up in sacred and mundane is what it's trying to point to is there are things that we think of as religious per se, things that are very obviously religious to us because we're trained to see them as religious. And then there are things that we don't necessarily think of as religious, but that are deeply intertwined with our religious identities. So the things that we believe and that we would easily define as religious, our theologies, doctrines, sacred narratives, and holy texts are also tied up with our social values and ethics, even our political values. How do our religious beliefs and other kinds of beliefs interact? Then there's behavior. So, we often recognize holy rites and rituals as clearly religious when we step into a mosque or church or synagogue or gurdwara or whatever kind of sacred house of worship we might be in. The acts that we do there, the rites and rituals that we do there, we easily classify as religious. But there's also our habits and daily practices, the things that we do day in and day out that we don't necessarily think of as religious, but that are clearly informing and informed by our religious identities. So let me give an example of that. My mother is Catholic, my father is Jewish. I was raised with both of those traditions, and I was often, have had conversations about what it means to believe in certain Catholic doctrine and participate in the rites and rituals of the church. And I've heard on a number of occasions Catholic priests say that for those who are lapsed Catholics, sometimes they might not necessarily have firm conviction, or they might question some of the rituals of the church and the doctrine of the church. And their response has often been, even if you're questioning, the best thing that you can do is go to church and actually participate in the life of the church, participate in those rites and rituals. And that will, by doing those actions, will actually help you understand what it means to be a Catholic. That by doing the actions, the beliefs will come from those actions. Or imagine that you grow up in a society in which it's the social norm to bow to your social superior. And so before you even you know why it is that you're doing what you're doing when you're a very, very young child, you're taught to bow to a social superior. How might that act of bowing, which is not necessarily in a religious setting, how might that act of bowing and prostrating your body before someone else actually shape the way that you think about your relationship with other things that are greater than yourself, whether that's God or something else? How might the bodily act actually shape our beliefs? Or if I've heard in certain strands of Zen Buddhist circles, you don't come to believe certain truths about life, about suffering, about non-self, just by sitting down and thinking about it. It's actually through seated meditation that you come to have a certain understanding of these truths within a Zen Buddhist tradition. So the things that we do, our habits and daily practices, and things that we do in a ritual setting, but also outside of a ritual setting, those behaviors can shape our beliefs, or at least they're in conversation with our beliefs. And then the final component is belonging. So belonging can name the community that we're part of when we say I'm Catholic or Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu or Methodist or Lutheran or whatever it might be, or Baha'i. But also our community, we belong to multiple communities at the same time. Our racial, ethnic, familial, gender, sexual, and other identities are shaping and being shaped by our religious identity. So for example, Reverend Dr. James Cone is considered a father of Black liberation theology, and he wrote a book called A Theology of Black Liberation. And in that book, he had a section called The Sources and Norms of Black Theology, where he's laying out, when we do Black theology, how do we do it? Where are we turning to do Black theology? And his first source or norm of Black theology isn't the Bible. It's not a belief in Jesus. He says that the first source of Black theology is the Black experience. And he says that in order to understand Black theology, you cannot, and to do Black theology, you have to start with the experience of Black suffering under systems of white racism in the United States. So he says the place to start for Black theology is the Black experience in a system of white racism, when he's writing in the 60s and 70s. So in various ways, our beliefs, our behaviors, our communities of belonging are all shaping and being shaped by one another. And so this model, I think, is meant to illustrate that. A traditional model, which is really a product of the Protestant Enlightenment, says that we as humans are rational creatures, that we read our sacred text of the Bible. Through reason, we come to understand what that sacred text means for us. And then based on that understanding, we then act in certain ways. So I might be a believing Christian, I read the Bible, I read the Beatitudes, I come through reason, come to understand that that means that I should behave charitably, and then I therefore behave charitably. So the belief leads to the behavior. That model is a very Protestant Enlightenment model of what religion is and how humans operate. And for over a century, religious studies scholars have sought to introduce more nuance into the conversation, to really think about how beliefs, behaviors, and belonging are all shaping and being shaped by one another. So that's, for some people, our beliefs lead to our behaviors, they shape our behaviors, but for some people, our behaviors are shaping our beliefs. For other people, the communities that we belong to shape our beliefs. So these things are all informing one another, they're all influencing one another. One example that I give is, again, from the Catholic tradition. Often when we hear about Catholicism in the United States, we learn about it, especially in the news, if we aren't Catholic, with reference to certain hot button social issues, abortion, same-sex marriage, the clerical celibacy, the ordination of women, the use of birth control. So those issues often come up in the news with regard to the Catholic Church. And I think many Americans know what the official stance is of the Catholic Church as an institution on those issues. We know that the institution of the Catholic Church is against the use of birth control, it's against same-sex marriage, it's against it's for clerical celibacy, it's against the use of birth control. What's fascinating is if you look at opinion polling from Pew and Gallup, you'll find that the majority of American Catholics, the laity, do not align with the Catholic Church on any of those issues. So the vast majority of American Catholics support the use of birth control, they support the ordination of women, they support allowing priests to get married and have children, they support same-sex marriage, and a slim majority on the last survey that I saw are pro-choice. So this I think illustrates a difference between the kinds of questions that a religious studies scholar asks and the kinds of questions that we might ask as religious people, as people within religious communities. Instead of evaluating whether people are good or bad Catholics, or whether they are or are not Catholics, the religious studies scholar asks, why does someone self-identify as a Catholic? What is in it for them? What's important to them about being Catholic? And this 3Bs model, I think, illustrates that. So when I read those statistics and I see that American Catholics are not aligning with the Catholic Church on those doctrinal issues, I understand that their religious identity isn't necessarily grounded in a belief, an assent to those doctrinal issues. They're either thinking about other kinds of beliefs that are important to them, or they're thinking about their behaviors, the things that they're doing and why that's important, or they're thinking about the importance of belonging to that community, whether like me, they are connected to generations of Italian Roman Catholics and that's part of our family story, part of our community. What it means to belong to my family is partially about being Italian Roman Catholic, or on my father's side, Jews who might not necessarily believe in God or have questions about God, but are strongly affiliated with the Jewish community for reasons of history and tradition and family. So the belief and behavior belonging framework, I hope, is pointing to a different kind of way of thinking about religious identity and religion that isn't just grounded in belief, and that in fact, for some people who are religious, belief isn't even the primary most important thing, that behaviors or communities of belonging can be important. Does that make sense, this sort of way of thinking about religious identity? And seeing some yeses, great. So this is one part. So let's keep this in mind then when we move to the next section. So my next question for you to respond to is, should religious freedom protect all aspects of religious expression equally? So if we think about religious expression, including beliefs, behaviors, and communities of belonging, should religious freedom protect all of those things? So I see Mike says absolutely not. Starting off strong. Great. Jeremy says not equally. Not equally, not if they conflict with the rights of others. Okay. Tim, thanks so much. I'm glad you were able to join. Hopefully I'll see you again soon. No, not everything equally. Slippery slope, need to draw the line somewhere. Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot of consensus that we shouldn't protect all of those things equally. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. One question that I would prompt you with now is, when going back to the term religious freedom, if we don't protect all aspects of religion equally, is religious freedom really a helpful term? Are we actually protecting religion? If we're not protecting all aspects of what it means to be religious, is it religious freedom? Is it freedom of belief? Is it something else? Is there a more appropriate term? And this is something that a lot of religious studies scholars ask. So there is a great book written by a scholar at Indiana University. I always forget if it's Indiana University or University of Indiana. Her name is Winifred Fallers Sullivan, and it's a book called The Impossibility of Religious Freedom. It's a really excellent book. I don't know that I agree with all of the conclusions of the book, but it's very well reasoned. And what she says essentially is that religious freedom is impossible because we shouldn't protect, and we don't protect, all aspects of religion equally. And in fact, what we do protect is belief. And as I said earlier, the model of thinking about belief as being primary and leading to behaviors is a very Protestant model. And so her take is that if we're just protecting belief, we're actually just protecting a Protestant version of religion and not actually protecting all different kinds of religion. So there's a lot to think about here, a lot to unpack. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is with a case. So I want to start with a case. So the case that I want to start with is one called Employment Division v. Smith. It's a lesser known case, I think, for the general public, but is very, very well known in the religious freedom world because it was very deeply unpopular. The decision was very unpopular, and it actually led to a series of pieces of legislation that are continuing to affect the way that we talk about religious freedom today. And so what I will do is I'll show a summary of the case that comes from a website called Oye, which is a really great resource for people interested in the Supreme Court. So we'll read a summary of the case, and then I'll ask you to predict what the Supreme Court said, and then we'll talk about some of the implications of it. So if someone feels brave enough to read the summary, please let me know.
I'm happy to read.
Great, thank you so much.
Got to move your picture so that I can see all the words. 2 counselors for a private drug rehabilitation organization ingested peyote, a powerful hallucinogen, as part of the religious ceremonies as members of Native American church. As a result of this conduct, the rehabilitation organization fired the counselors. The counselors filed a claim for unemployment compensation. The government denied them benefits because the reason for their dismissal was considered work-related misconduct. The state appellate court reversed the denial of benefits, finding that the denial violated their First Amendment right to the free exercise of religion. The state Supreme Court affirmed the appellate court. The U.S. Supreme Court vacated the Oregon Supreme Court's judgment against the disgruntled employees and returned the case to the Oregon courts to determine whether or not sacramental use of illegal drugs violated Oregon state's drug laws. On remand, the Oregon Supreme Court concluded that while Oregon drug laws prohibit the consumption of illegal drugs or sacramental religious uses, This prohibition violated the Free Exercise Clause. The case returned to the U.S. Supreme Court in this new posture.
Great, thank you so much. Are there any questions about this summary? Okay, so then the question before the court is, sorry, I have too many windows open. So can the a state deny unemployment benefits to a worker fired for using illegal drugs for religious purposes? So what do you think the court said?
It sounded like the Supreme Court decided that they could deny benefits for the use of illegal drugs.
So you think they said, yeah, you can deny the benefits. Okay. Anyone think the opposite? Okay. So let's look at the opinion. I think the opinion is very interesting and important. So the conclusion, you're right. The conclusion of the court, they said yes. And here I think it's very fascinating that it's important to know that the opinion was written by Justice Scalia, who is a very conservative justice who's been seen as a champion of religious freedom. And Justice Antonin Scalia actually wrote for the majority and said that the court has never held that an individual's religious beliefs excuse the person from compliance with an otherwise valid law prohibiting conduct that government is free to regulate. So in other words, if there's a law that applies to everyone, and that's a valid law, just because someone says that it infringes on their religious rights doesn't mean that the law is invalid, doesn't mean that they should provide an exemption to that person. And he said, allowing exceptions to every state law or regulation affecting religion would, quote, open the prospect of constitutionally required exemptions from civic obligations of almost every conceivable kind. And he cited as examples compulsory military service, payment of taxes, vaccination requirements, or child neglect laws. So he said, for example, there's a neutral law that says that people should pay their taxes. And if someone said, well, for my, in my religious tradition, it's wrong to pay an unjust government taxes, should we provide an exemption to that person? And Scalia said, no, we shouldn't just provide an exemption just because someone has a sincerely held religious belief doesn't mean that they should get an exemption from a neutrally applicable law. And he actually drew on precedent for the court and basically said that it would allow every man to become a law unto himself, that it would lead to legal chaos, that if people said for reasons of sincerely held belief, they could get an exemption from any neutrally applicable law, it just wouldn't work. That I think is a very broad and there are many implications to that line of reasoning. And in fact, Scalia recognized himself that it might do damage to marginalized religious communities more than to majority religious communities. So he said it might fairly be said that leaving accommodation to the political process will place at a relative disadvantage those religious practices that are not widely engaged in. But that unavoidable consequence of democratic government must be preferred to a system in which each conscience is a law unto itself, or in which judges weigh the social importance of all laws against the centrality of all religious beliefs. So can anyone think of any examples of how this line of reasoning might lead to decisions that we would disagree with, decisions that we would find problematic? So if the line of reasoning that there's a neutrally applicable law, it applies to everyone, and people shouldn't get exemptions just because it's a sincerely held belief, where might that lead to some challenges for us? Where might we disagree with a decision?
Head coverings.
Head coverings, great. So can you say more about that?
Well, like if a business bans head coverings or hats, if you will, then, and it's technically neutrally applied, it'll make it so that hijab wearers cannot go there if that was upheld exactly as is. Yeah,
right. So if a school or another, establishment, a business says we have a rule that it's a neutrally applicable, it applies to everyone, that people cannot wear head coverings because it's part of our uniform policy or dress code. And someone said, well, I'm religious and I want to wear a hijab or a turban or a kippah. And they said, sorry, it's neutrally applicable. We don't have to make an exemption for you. It'll lead to chaos otherwise. potentially this line of reasoning that Scalia is talking about could lead to that kind of scenario. Joanna said in the chat, someone saying, I don't want to give you a marriage license to a same-sex couple because of my religion. Yeah, we've seen that play out, that there's a neutrally applicable law, and someone says that they want an exemption to that law. So Scalia's line of reasoning would be, we shouldn't provide an exemption to the government employee who does not want to give you a marriage license. So I think the examples that we can give there are many examples, and they don't, and they might lead to outcomes that we think of as more progressive or more conservative, more aligned with platforms of the Democratic Party or more Republican Party, that there are people for a variety of reasons, both progressive and conservative, who want exemptions from neutrally applicable laws because they want to live out their religious tradition as they see fit, because they see a conflict between their, the law as it is and their own convictions. For example, another example, a more progressive example, there was someone who was leaving bottles of water in the desert in the American Southwest for immigrants who were coming across the border without documentation. And he saw that as an important part of his ministry, that he was ensuring their survival by leaving out water. And this was against a neutrally applicable law that said you can't sort of aid and abet people who are crossing the border illegally. And he said, well, I want an exemption to that rule. I see this as an important part of my religious identity. This action that I'm doing is important to who I am. And so I want an exemption, not just to believe that we should help others, but actually to enact that, to actually help others. And so the court had to decide, do we allow an exemption to a neutrally applicable rule or not? So we can come up with examples both from progressive and from sort of conservative circles of people who say, there's a neutrally applicable rule, and for religious freedom to mean something, it can't just mean that I can believe what I want to believe, but also I should be able to behave in certain ways. And those behaviors are not just the things that we do in a church or a mosque or a synagogue, our rites and rituals, but also these other kinds of behaviors that extend out into all kinds of public life. So that's the challenge. That was the challenge before the court. And Scalia saw this. He saw that there would be challenges to neutrally applicable laws, not just on one side of the political spectrum, but across the political spectrum. And he said, no, we're just not going to allow it. We can't allow for this sort of anarchy to happen.
I'm sorry,
well,
what is the definition of neutral with neutrally applicable? How do you find out what's neutral?
So in that sense, in the legal sense, it applies to everyone, to religious and non-religious people. So it doesn't target one particular group. It doesn't say this law only applies to Muslims, or this law only applies to religious folks, or this law only applies to secular folks. It has to apply to everyone. So one contemporary example that we're seeing all sorts of court cases right now are rules about gatherings, large gatherings in the age of COVID. So there are all sorts of rules that states and local governments are implementing that ban all gatherings of 10 people or more. And there are small carve-outs for essential services, but those essential services are not identified as religious or non-religious. They're just identified as things that will keep people alive, basically. And so these are bans on gatherings that apply to both religious and non-religious communities. It applies to a business as much as it applies to a church or a gurdwara. And so in that sense, it's seen as a neutrally applicable law. It applies to everyone. And so what we're seeing now are people asking for exemptions from that neutrally applicable rule because they want to gather in their religious communities, and they want an exemption. They say it's a substantial burden on their sincerely held belief. And so therefore they want an exemption from that rule. So this, I think, is then, so this is the context. So this Supreme Court opinion, Employment Division v. Smith, when it was handed down, was incredibly unpopular among the American public and among lawmakers. It was actually so unpopular. I think it's hard in 2020 to remember back to this era when religious freedom was not so hyper partisan. It was not incredibly polarized. And what happened next, I think, seems almost unthinkable today, just 30 or so years later. What happened next is that Congress got together and passed a bipartisan bill overwhelmingly. I believe it was unanimous in the House and something like 97-3 in the Senate. It was signed by President Clinton, a Democratic president, and it was called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so what this act said is that they basically tried to overturn the Supreme Court. And they said that the Supreme Court got it wrong and that there should be a different kind of calculus that goes into cases about religious exemptions. So they established a sort of three-part rule. So the first part is they said, first you have to identify, is there a substantial burden on a sincerely held religious belief? And so what you hear there is they're not saying a core belief or an essential belief, which I think a religious studies scholar would take issue with. They're saying a substantial burden on a sincerely held religious belief. That religious belief doesn't have to be held by an entire community. It can be held by just one person. And it doesn't have to be something that's central. It can be anything as long as it's a sincerely held belief. So that's really important. Then it said, if there's a substantial burden on a sincerely held belief, and the government is taking an action that is prohibiting or limiting that sincerely held belief, then the government has to have a compelling state interest. So that's sort of a second prong. There has to be a compelling state interest. So for example, in the age of COVID, when governments are enacting these laws that prohibit large gatherings, they're asserting a compelling state interest of public health and safety. And they're saying that interest in public health and safety overrides, in this particular instance, the right to free exercise. And then the third part is also incredibly important, that the action of the government, the law that they pass, has to be the least restrictive means for furthering the compelling state interest. So in the age of COVID again, so we've banned this law, these large gatherings. And where we're seeing the court cases come up now are really on this third part. Is it the least restrictive option? So if the interest is in protecting public health and safety by keeping people apart, is it actually really in the government's interest to ban drive-in services where people drive up, they're in their car? This happened in, I think, Kentucky or Kansas, I'm one of the two. And people were driving up into the parking lot and sort of attending a religious service in their car. And the government wanted to shut that down. And the court case basically said, is it really advancing the interest? Is it the least restrictive way to advance the interest by banning people coming in cars? How does that protect public health and safety? So this act, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed in a bipartisan way, established a new level of scrutiny for Supreme Court cases, saying there has to be a compelling state interest and it has to be the least restrictive way if there's a burden on a sincerely held religious belief. Well, that opens up another set of questions. And so I guess we can look at some of those too. I think it looks like we have enough time. But before I go on to the next scenario, are there any questions about anything I've said so far? Do you have questions about the RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or this idea about what religion is and how that ties in with religious freedom? Any questions at all?
I do, actually. How does the compelling state interest piece change anything from how it was before? I mean, I see the, what was it? Least restrictive piece. I understand that, but how does the compelling interest piece change?
So the compelling interest piece, so going back to the Employment Division v. Smith, one of the questions is, you would have to start with the question, is there really a compelling interest to keep, drugs out of people's system? So what's the real interest here? What interest is being advanced by not providing unemployment benefits to people who have peyote in their system for sacramental reasons? If they showed up under the influence at work, you might be able to say that there's a compelling state interest in making sure that people aren't, high at work or under the influence at work. But if it's in their system and if it was used for sacramental reasons as part of a religious service, what is there a compelling state interest there? I'm not saying that the court would have said no, but it would have required the court to go through a different kind of reasoning to arrive at their conclusion.
I see. Thank you.
How does sincerely held belief get proven in a court? Or what are some of the guidelines for determining if somebody has a sincerely held belief?
That's the million-dollar question. And so that is, there is no one answer to that. Courts really struggle with this in part because of the Establishment Clause. And the Establishment Clause, says that the government can't favor one religion over another or religion over non-religion. And so courts sort of tiptoe around this. They don't want to make pronouncements about whether something is truly religious, or they're very hesitant to make a pronouncement about whether something is truly religious or not, because to do so would be to support some version of orthodoxy or other. So let's say this is just a made-up example. Let's say you identify as a Christian, and you say that an important part for you about being a Christian is, not eating meat on Wednesdays and Tuesdays. Well, for many, there are some Christian communities that try to avoid meat. There are some Christian communities that don't eat meat on Friday. There's different kinds of rules, but it's quite idiosyncratic to not eat meat on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. But if you say that you're a Christian, and you say it's a sincerely held belief that to be Christian, to be a good Christian, is to not eat meat on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, the court has to decide, are we competent? And the court, as an arm of the government, is the government competent to decide whether this is the right way of being a Christian, whether it's authentic to be a Christian to not eat meat on Tuesdays and Wednesdays? And so that's the tricky, that's the position that the court is often put in, to decide whether these idiosyncratic practices or beliefs merit religious freedom protection. And that's what Scalia was pointing to in his decision, is he's saying it might be said that leaving accommodation to the political process will disadvantage certain religious practices, because for people who have these idiosyncratic practices, they're not going to get protections, they're not going to get carve-outs in laws that say we should provide exemptions to those Christians who don't eat meat on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So the sincerely held belief part is seen as central to RFRA, because it isn't requiring that it be a widely held belief, as long as it's sincerely held for the person. And so the court has to make a determination, and they can ask a variety of questions to say, is this opportunistic or not? So another example is, there have been cases about church, I don't remember what they're called, like Church of the Cannabis or Church of Cannabis or whatever it might be called. But it's among people who say that smoking marijuana is an important sacramental ritual and an important sacrament. And so they want exemptions from marijuana laws that allow them to smoke. And the court they've tread carefully and tried to decide, is this really a religious practice, or is it sort of opportunistic? It's not sincerely held. That for these people, they said they started calling themselves religious so that they could smoke weed, but that they're not actually committed to a level of sincerity that the court can respect. And I don't think, and this is again, another way that religious studies scholars critique or bring questions to religious freedom as it's enacted legally, is in the religious studies world, there's a lot more openness to recognizing the self-identification of communities, and recognizing that religion is a very fluid category and very hard to define. And so in some senses, in the religious studies world, religion can mean so many things, and people recognize the ambiguity of the term religion in a way that it would lead to many questions in the court. Well, what then do you actually protect?
Thank you.
Yeah. Great. So I think we'll look at one more. We'll go through this one briefly. I'll read the opinion just so that we have it in mind. But I think this gives you a sense of what can happen in post-RFRA world with the RFRA, with Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So this is from a case that I think more people have heard of, the Hobby Lobby case. And in this case, the Green family owns and operates Hobby Lobby stores, a national arts and crafts chain with over 500 stores and over 13,000 employees. The Green family has organized the business around the principles of the Christian faith and has explicitly expressed the desire to run the company according to biblical precepts, one of which is the belief that the use of contraception is immoral. under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, ACA, or Obamacare, employment-based group health care plans must provide certain types of preventative care, such as FDA-approved contraceptive methods. While there are exemptions available for religious employers and nonprofit religious institutions, there are no exemptions for for-profits. So on September 12th, the Greens, as representatives of Hobby Lobby, sued Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, and challenged the contraception mandate. So the question before the court is, does the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993 allow for a for-profit company to deny its employees health coverage of contraception to which the employees would otherwise be entitled based on the religious exceptions of the company's owners? And so the answer to that was yes. So Justice Samuel Alito delivered the opinion for a 5-4 majority and said that the Congress intended for RFRA to be read as applying to corporations since they are composed of individuals who use them to achieve desired ends. And because the contraception requirement forces religious corporations to fund what they consider abortion, which goes against their stated religious principles, it creates a substantial burden that is not the least restrictive method. Interestingly, in Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent, she argues that there is no violation of the freedom of religion when an infringement on that right is merely an incidental consequence of an otherwise valid statute. So here we hear echoes of what Scalia said. There's an otherwise valid statute that requires something equally for all, and it's not an infringement on a right when there's an incidental consequence. Additionally, judicial precedent states that religious beliefs or observances must not impinge on the rights of third parties, as the sought-after exemption would do. So my question after this case, so here we see the consequences of RFRA, sort of the opposite decision that we saw in Employment Division v. Smith, where there's a mutually applicable statute, but the Supreme Court is granting an exemption here. My questions for you are, is religious freedom possible? So what does religious freedom actually protect? So does the First Amendment protect primarily belief or belief in behavior equally? And does could also be, you could read it as should. Should the First Amendment protect primarily belief or belief in behavior equally? And now we've seen some examples that might be more progressive or leftist sort of examples of people who want an exemption from a mutually applicable law, and examples that we might classically, at least in today's political climate, characterize as more conservative examples of people who want an exemption from a mutually applicable law. And if the First Amendment primarily protects belief, does it truly protect religious freedom? What does religion mean and whose religion is protected? So if we say, well, one way to do this is to only protect belief and not necessarily the actions that we think of as religious, are we really protecting religious freedom? Or is it just freedom of belief? Is it a Protestant religious freedom, or is it religious freedom for everyone? And if we say that it extends to behavior, are there limits? So you might say, well, it protects belief and behavior, but behaviors that target or that affect third parties, that create third-party harm, shouldn't be allowed. But then we're limiting behavior in a way that we don't limit belief. So belief, for example, we often say is inviolable, that you can believe anything no matter what, no matter how abhorrent, and you can talk about those beliefs no matter how abhorrent they are. You can say terrible things, but it's protected by not only freedom of speech, but also religious freedom. And so if you limit behavior for certain reasons, are you saying that it's because religious behaviors aren't as important as religious beliefs to our religious identities? Or are you limiting those behaviors just because of their implications? Not because they're more or less important than beliefs, but because they have an effect on other people. And if you're saying that they have an effect on other people, are you saying that beliefs, the things that you believe and talk about, don't have an effect? When you say, I hate Jews, or I hate queer people, or I hate Black people, whatever, or white people, whatever it might be, is that doing harm? And should that be limited in the same way that actually passing laws that negatively affect the civil rights of those people isn't allowed? So those are my questions. Those are real questions for you. Those are my honest questions for you, and I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So I will start, if that's okay. I found the dichotomy of protecting beliefs, which you kind of paralleled with the freedom of speech, versus protecting the actions within religion versus the actions that might be a consequence of hateful speech. Very interesting. And it left me with the question of, is something like Nazism a religion that ought to be protected as a religion? And I think that that's never been asked, to the best of my knowledge, on a court level or even an individual group level. We've certainly asked the freedom of speech, but definitely left me with that question. I personally, as a Jewish clergy person who's, grew up understanding Judaism as a minority religion in a majority country, I have always felt that that there should be a way that people who have religious freedom, that it does not impose upon other people's religious freedoms. I don't know how you make a law about that, but that seems to be like where my gut goes, understanding the context of how I was brought up and my personal faith traditions as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's certainly one thing that's a line of reasoning that some people have proposed for religious freedom, is that my freedom ends where your rights begin, or where protections for you as a person begin. But one can imagine scenarios where two people are claiming protections. So the case in Colorado, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case that went to the Supreme Court, is one example of that. Whatever we think about the merits of their sides, and I personally have a strong opinion about this, what they say before the court is that there are two compelling rights that are in confrontation, that aren't reconcilable. One is the right of a same-sex couple to have a wedding cake, to be able to go to a business that's open on Main Street and not fear discrimination based on an identity category, such as sexual orientation. And the other is for the baker, is in asserting a claim to not be required, not be compelled in their speech and action, that the government shouldn't require people to say certain things that they don't believe in. And so here we have a contest of two people saying that the beliefs of the other person is forcing the opposite party to act in a way that is against their sincerely held beliefs. So they aren't casting it as forcing, neither party is casting it as forcing the other person to do something, but both are feeling forced, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
So I'm seeing a lot of interesting discussion in the chat. So government can't regulate thoughts, only behaviors. Even in conspiracy or attempted crimes, steps must be taken that infringe on others' rights or encourage harmful behavior. Yeah, so this is an interesting, this is something that I think that there is a difference, an important difference between beliefs and actions. What's fascinating from the religious studies world is that there are some scholars who are blurring the distinction between belief and action. One that comes to mind is a dear friend and brilliant scholar named Nikki Clements at Rice University, who looks at the early church fathers and the ways that they view asceticism and what they believe and how they act, and sort of blurs this distinction between the two. I'm not saying that it certainly doesn't seem to be the rule in legal circles, but again, here we see the religious studies world question some of the assumptions that we have in the legal world about this distinction that we make between regulating thoughts and behaviors. And so she and I had a really fascinating discussion about education, for example, and compulsory education, where we require kids to go to schools. We don't require them to go to public schools, but that's certainly where a majority of students go. And when public schools are run by the government and students are learning from government employees and they're taught to think in very specific ways, is that a kind of regulation of thought that we allow and that we sort of mask as thought regulation by the government. Again, she and I agree on many things. I am a strong supporter of public schools. I'm a product of public schools. But they're asking us to question some assumptions we have about whether or not the government allows certain regulation of thought as well as behavior. And then to Eileen's point about beliefs written and followed for thousands of years, this is actually a live question about, does it matter how long something has been, a tradition? So Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for a long time in this country have had to make the case that they are a religion, that they deserve religious freedom protections because it is relatively new as a religious tradition. And we see this for traditions that are even newer, traditions from the 20th and 21st centuries that are new and developing. To what extent do they merit certain kinds of protections? So I know that it is 1 o'clock or a little after 1, and I want to respect your time. I really appreciate you being here with me today to talk about these really, I think, interesting and complex and important issues. They're issues that really touch at the heart of what it means to protect religious freedom, what the First Amendment means. And so I hope this was a very generative conversation. My intention for this conversation was not to answer many questions as much to raise new questions and to give us new ways of asking about religious freedom and thinking about how religious freedom operates in the United States and the way our assumptions that we bring to the words religion and to the word freedom. So I hope that this has been interesting. I am, like I said, that this was recorded. I am happy to share the slide deck, and my full-time job is to be a resource to members of communities like you who are interested in these topics. So I am available. My email address, I'll type into the chat bar. It's bmarcus, M-A-R-C-U-S, @freedomforum.org. Jeremy has my contact information as well if you'd like to get in touch. I'm available on Twitter. So if you'd like to continue the conversation, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. That was awesome. I just want to say a couple of notes for the attendees here. In the chat, I'm also sharing a SurveyMonkey request. If you can provide feedback for us, that'd be awesome. Also, we do have a couple more events coming up next week and tomorrow. Tomorrow we have Open Hearts, Open Minds, Open Conversations, and it's a fairly relaxed conversation. Tomorrow it will be about grief and lamentation. And then next Tuesday at noon, I'm going to be hosting a new program that we're calling Making the Familiar Strange. And it will be set up a little bit like an interfaith Bible study of sorts, but we're going to be looking at the first few chapters of Genesis and really trying to read them from a new perspective, always trying to push our boundaries of comfort. So definitely register for that if you are interested. Thank you. And if you have any more parting words, Ben, that would be amazing. But thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. I'm, in the past month, because everyone is home or trying to social distance because of COVID, I've had the opportunity, the silver lining is that it's created the opportunity for me to speak with people in Wyoming, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in Nebraska. And it's always a pleasure to meet different folks from around the country and have these conversations, and to know that in our homes, we're able to have these really intimate and complex and hard discussions about what religious freedom means, and to continue forming ourselves as civic-minded individuals who are committed to this American experiment and to living together with our deepest differences. So thank you for inviting me into your homes, and I hope that we're able to continue the conversation.
I'd just like to pipe in and say thank you very, very much for everyone for being here, and mostly to Jeremy for making it happen, Ben for all of your wisdom. Because this was recorded and we had a small group, this is such an important message for stakeholders in the Tri-Faith Initiative to be articulate about. And so if there are people who you think should have heard today's message and you would like to be able to share the link to the recording with them, please help us amplify this message. It is, important conversation for the time. So,
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Awesome. And thanks to Jeremy and to Wendy for leading Tri-Faith. I know that they're not the only leadership, but I'm grateful for your leadership and for inviting me here. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Everyone have a good day.
Be healthy.
You too.